Hello, good morning, and welcome back to Reaper Pro Tips with me, your host, Anne, Disembodied Hands, Quindy, Minions, Justin, and John, and... Are you gonna come up? Are you gonna come up, Puffer? Come on, Papa! Yay! Good girl, Kiki! And Kiki. Hi, Keekers. You're such a good girl. You're being a good girl and not eating Mommy's arm today. Thank you. Good girl. Did you grow another adult brain cell? Maybe. All right, little fuzz. Let's go. Good girl. Yeah. Yeah, Miss Sassy Tail. Good girl. Yes, you're a good girl. Okay, you've got your bully stick. Be good. Haha. Hello, hello. How is everyone? Oh, it is tax day, isn't it? Maybe I should text David. I text him. So it's tax day. Are we good? Because I don't remember signing anything. Ah, is it? Yeah, I approved it yesterday, Turgeon. I didn't know how fast it was going to populate. That's pretty cool. Is it linked? Hold on. I have to order one. I'm going to order my author copies from Ingram's. There I am. There's my Kindle Unlimited. Yep, they linked it. Sweet. Yeah, that hardcover was expensive. I had to price it at $29.99 to even get like, man, guys, it's like the margins on these are so slim. I'm like, how does New York even function? Like their whole business model in New York publishing is predicated on like print. But you make such a tiny, like I don't even make $2 off each of those books at $30 price point. It's ridiculous. Oh, good. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Crowley. Yay! I am currently editing chapter 15 in book 2. That's about, if its length is going to end up around the first one, I think. So that means about 30 chapters, and that means I'm about halfway through on the editing. And some of those later chapters are going to take quite a bit of rewriting. So we'll see, but... Yeah, right. And that's the thing, right? Because they are a book, an actual like store can order it for less, right? Like if I order my book, I'm paying a lot less than that's why you only get a certain amount of money as the person who actually writes the book and puts it up, or the person who's producing the book, is that the discount for the industry for distribution is 55%. So right away off of that $30, woof, you're down to like 15, like less than 15, so maybe 13, right? And then, then the bookstore is going to go and it's going to price it at retail, but it might have another, it has to pay for labor and its store costs and everything else. And yeah, yes. So yeah. Yes. Oh, good. I'm glad you all read a review. Thank you, Carly. Thank you. Or just star me. You can always just star me, but written reviews are cool. Whoa, you beat me to it, Zachariah. You beat me to it. But that's all right. That's cool. It's really neat to know, though, that it populates that fast. Like, I honestly approved it just yesterday afternoon, and Amazon already has it today. So, but yeah. If not, it's their problem. Yeah, it's bad. Yeah. Fussing probably doesn't do much, unless they've come to depend on you fussing. But yeah, so it's, yeah, right. Thousands to millions. Well, yeah, not millions anymore, actually, Turgeon. Like, book sales are down. Like, you're considered, okay, so a New York publisher, if you're indie, let's just start mixing our paint here for Cathy while we talk about this. A New York publisher, to get the New York publisher to actually, like people, for a lot of people, it's still the dream to, like, if they independently publish a book, they still would love a New York deal. And so if you're going to get the attention of New York, you essentially have to sell tens of thousands of copies. That will make New York sit up and take notice. So these days, millions are very, very rare. Like, I can tell you actually, that George R. R. Martin, the day that Dance with Dragons was released, sold over 1 million books. But that was a book that was like anticipated for years in a very hot series. It was in like right before the HBO series came out, I think. And it's Gurm, so he's like the top name in epic fantasy. So nobody's selling millions anymore unless you're at that in that league. But if you sell tens of thousands, New York considers that very good. At that point, you could probably go to get an agent, and pitch your next project to New York. Yeah. Yeah, hundreds of thousands is very rare. Very, very rare. Yeah. Yeah, so I actually have that insight since I've talked to actual authors about it who are selling those numbers. But yeah, it's a rare thing. So yeah, if you're an indie author and you're selling like hundreds to thousands, if you're in the thousands range, like, then you're really good. Like, you're doing really, really, really well on your books. And that's like if your title, like if your every title is selling over 1,000, right? So if you've got 12 titles and you sell, you make $1,000 off each title, then you're making $12K a year, right? This is why, and that, by the way, is the average amount of money that an author, USA author that defines themselves as an author and is trying to write, seriously, that's the average amount they make is $12,400 a year. But yeah, I'm super. That's a really hard call. That's a really hard call, Turja, because New York publishing still is married to the print market. Like, everything they do is trying to protect the print market. And they were claiming that the print market is still 80% of their sales. But I and others are very dubious about that claim. But on the other side, it could be true. And you know why it could be true? Because traditional publishing prices ebooks way high. So ebooks are still very much an indie publisher, like a market that you can make an imprint in, like make an impact, because traditional publishing is not pricing their ebooks low because they don't want to undermine print. They see it as undermining print, and they could be right. But for the vast majority of indie authors, ebooks are far, far and above most of their sales. But then they're also pricing ebooks at 99 cents to $9.99, right? And most of them are under $7.99, which is several dollars below an ebook from traditional publishing, unless that book is old. Like, I'm picking up the Tony Hillerman, Lee Porn and She mystery series, Navajo mystery series right now, that I had back in the day, and I read it back in the day, but it's been ages. And those books, because they've been around since the 70s, are priced at $7.99 on the Kindle store. But if you look at any newer book, you're going to be paying $12 to $13.99 on the Kindle store if it's from a traditional publisher. But yeah, so it's all this, and there was a war about this a while ago. Back when I was actually attending Viable Paradise, they were in court over it, where traditional publishing wanted to force Amazon to fix prices higher, and Amazon was like, no way. We want to be able to price ebooks at what we want to be able to price ebooks at, like as far as our ranges, our recommended ranges. And traditional publishing got in trouble over that because they actually racketeered. Like, they got slapped big time by the courts because they were fixing prices by communicating with each other. And that's illegal. So, yeah. They were doing it to try to fight Amazon, but it was still illegal. So it was all a crazy thing. It's very interesting. The history of the publishing companies is very interesting. But yeah. So I don't know these days what percentage of sales are through. I suspect that traditional publishers make less just because they're pricing their wares higher. It's simple economics at that point. But because if you can get, like, if the ebook is $13.99, but you can get the physical book for $15 or $16.99, chances are you're just going to get the physical book. It's like it's only $3 more. which is kind of their point. All right, so we want to work on Cathy's steel, and we were talking about going cyan, magenta, yellow mixes with this, so I guess I better get out my cyan, my magenta, and my yellow. By the way, actually, one of the things I liked about Mark's class is that he debunked the whole cyan, magenta, yellow thing. He pointed out that with the correct blue and a decent red, you can mix a decent purple. But if you try to make put magenta with yellow, you can't necessarily get a hypersaturated orange. So I think he's like, that's his shtick. But I always just feel that cyan, magenta, yellow is just kind of a gimmick. Like, you can do the same thing with red, yellow, blue. I mean, I was painting with red, yellow, blue on my lumberjack. I was actually using, one thing I didn't like is I did actually use a green phase yellow during that class. Because technically the green phase yellow is closer to a pure pigment yellow. But I was still annoyed at it. Yeah. Well, yeah, one man fighting another man. Yeah. Yeah, here you go. Here you go, Bryce, since you're here today. Let me back up a bit because he's bigger. This is Dude. I worked on Dude at the class. There you go. Yeah, David, we both went. It was our bonding for the weekend, our cool thing. So yeah, I walked away with some new tricks. I mean, and some old tricks, and oh yeah. Well, a lot of times, but Bryce, I go to these things with more. I want the philosophy. Like, I'm pretty sure that any technique he shows me is just a variation on a technique I know, but he may use it in a different way, and he may do things like think about things differently, which is really valuable to me. So the biggest takeaways I got from his class were actually mindset things. But that said, he does a really unique thing with the way he does like textures, where he's actually using the paint and keeping it super thick. So he's actually doing an impasto. Like he is actually creating a very, very fine texture that actually the paint is thick enough that it does stand up in little bumps. Like, it's not super smooth. And he works with that on purpose. He wants that effect to aid how it looks, right? So that it actually does, each little clump does stand up a little bit. Each little stitch does bulge up a little bit from the surface of the model. So, and when you do that, your paint also picks up a little more shine. Typically, if you're working with a kind of an eggshell, anything other than a dead matte, it'll be a little bit shinier because you're using it a little bit thicker, and the resin will just pick up the light. So that can also aid in the way your light plays on the model. Yeah, they got cost price fixing, Christoma. This was a while ago. But yeah, Bryce, my two big takeaways were from his class were be conscious of your intention with them. It's not necessary to finish every model or every part of every model the highest standard. Like, often I get hung up and stalled out in my painting because I start a model and I just kind of ground out on it. Like, I do the part that I'm really excited about, and then I'm like, and I want to move along. But I always was like, it's like finish everything on your plate, right? It's that mindset where I'm like, no, I need to finish the model, but I don't need to finish the model. Like, David is so much better at this than me. If David runs out of love for a mini, he just tosses it in the closet or puts it on the shelf. He removes it entirely and he starts something new, and he has no problem with that. And I have had a problem with that. So now I'm just like, you know what? I don't have to finish the damn Knoll bus. I blend, the other side is a little bit more rough, right? Because you can see the colors that I'm just working in there. So, but I blend as I go. That is the difference, actually, Bryce. And that's the wonderful thing about Mark. And I really like Mark. But he's like, I'm not out to change your style. I'm just out to give you tools to switch it up and to make your style, try out some different things, right? So, like, I blend as I go on this stuff typically. And so he when he came up to me, because he always blocks it. He blocks it in and then he blends. And when he came up, I'm like, I'm sorry, it's blended. He's like, it's okay, it's how you paint. But I used all the things that he was pointing out. And he really liked my colors. So there's a lot of green in this skin tone, by the way, you guys. It's hard to see on the camera, but there's a lot of olive green. So yeah. You're more like David with that. It's a really healthy mindset, Agent Marvel. Hang on to it. Like, I just have this thing about finishing stuff, and maybe I'm a completionist, but yeah, so that's what I did. So yeah, going into a model knowing your intention, like if you really are just like, I want to try this new thing on this model and I'm not intending to finish it, like just keeping that in mind and not beating yourself up if you don't finish it, Bryce. And then the other thing that he said that was really, really useful to me was he pointed out that if you're going to take chances and like try new things, do it at the beginning of the model, because you can always fix it or paint over it or even reprime it. But the further along you get, the more scared you get to screw it up. And that's something that once you hear it, you're like, oh, of course that's true, but you don't think about it right until you hear it brought up. And it's definitely something we can all keep in mind, because a lot of us are trying to get better, we're trying to push ourselves, we're trying to a new technique, right? But if we wait until later in the model to try that new technique, we're not going to want to do it, because it's just, we're going to be afraid. We're going to be too afraid. So the knit is just straight up, like pure, like here, you can kind of see it. So let's get close. You can see it. I always leave my my class models impartial, by the way. I seldom finish them, because for me, I want to see the process. So I started out with a blend. You see that red to purple, red to blue blend down there? And you see those guidelines there? I actually ended up just like taking away, like ignoring the guidelines for the most part. But I did start with one guideline down the center and then work out from there. But these are just little red brush strokes, like little stipples, bop, 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 bop. And then up here is where I went over those stipples with the orange to bring out different light and pattern. And I ran out of time at that point, because I was having to run home and give Kiki her walk and give her, I'd eat lunch and all that. So I was missing out on 2 hours during the middle of the class. But that's how it's really simple. It's really simple. The only thing that you need is brush control and patience for this. Yeah, if you paint on short deadlines, that can also make you like no risk, because you're like, I just need to get done. But yeah, the way he did the leather texture was new to me, and it turned out really well. So I'm gonna integrate that into some of my future stuff. I'm gonna put Mr. Dude away. But yeah, I keep Dude, like, the only class model I've actually finished was my Kirill one, because it was really close, and I felt like I'd internalized all the techniques, so I felt like I could finish it. But often with models like this, and definitely with this one, until I practice a bit more, I'm going to leave it in progress with parts of it in various stages, so that I can remember that what essentially the miniature itself becomes my class notes. Just a lot of little wavy lines, and you wouldn't think about it, but his thing with textures, not with the sweater, but with everything else, is building up. Starting with a simple stroke, and brush stroke is key with Mark, which is very interesting that he brought up the way to do different brush strokes and the way you want to, the way that a brush stroke is how you create texture, like varying your brush stroke is the best way to create texture. So wavy lines built up, and layered up, and then a different color, and layering, and then another, and then a glaze, and then a layer, and a glaze. So a lot of glazing and layering with textures, which actually is interesting because you can't overwork it or you'll lose it. So like you start with your wavy lines, and at first it just looks like wavy trash, and you're just like, oh my God, I hate this. It's terrible. And you put in a few more lines, and you're like, well, maybe. And then you glaze it, and then you put in a few more lines, and then you add a highlight, and you're like, oh, okay. But if you keep going too much with the layer and the glazes, you will wipe out your texture or make it really refined. So if you're looking for a really smooth texture, that would work. But yeah, if you overwork it, then you lose it. So it's it was a very interesting. The funny thing, Bryce, is that David took one look at the way that he was doing leather, and he's like, the result is just like your soldier. It's just your soldier you did tighter, like you just did more methodical, right? Like I was already using a lot of the techniques on soldier that he demoed in the class just differently, right? So his way to do leather, though, with the wavy lines crisscrossing, not even really crisscrossing, they kind of crisscross each other at a diagonal. But that technique is very fast, which I like. And that's one thing that I get from these classes that I don't otherwise get, right? Is that a lot of these guys paint for a living or have painted for a living. So they have essentially refined their technique to the point where it's all, they've got it down to the fastest way to accomplish this texture, right? So that's very useful because I paint slow and I'm always kind of looking for how do I get this texture down quicker than just going and like painstakingly painting it. But yeah. So cool. Actually, I'm going to put on my real quick, since my book is now out in hardcover, I'm going to put it on my to-do list to order my author copies. Order author hardcover from Ingram's. So I'll order directly from the distributor because I really want to see the quality of it. Which is one thing I don't like about Ingram's. Like from Amazon, if I produced a hardcover on Amazon, I would be able to order an author proof before it ever went live. But with Ingram's, the only thing I can do is review the file and make a, this looks okay, judgment, and then say do it, right? And then if I want to change the file afterwards, I would normally have to pay, but because I'm a member of the Alliance of Independent Authors, I get a free code. Yay for business associations. But yeah, I do, Kreniko. This is the cool thing about buying direct from authors, all right? So authors who do have a store on their website, which I'll probably eventually do, but just not right now because I've got a lot on my plate and I want to get book 2 done. But we get a really good discounted rate. Like we almost get the book at cost when the author orders a copy, which means that if you buy from an author, they get a much higher cut. Instead of just $2 or $3, it's like $10. The author can usually even afford to give a slight discount and still make, like a decent amount of money from each book. So that would be a good reason to buy directly from the author if you want to support them, right? But I don't mind people buying from Amazon because I want reviews and I want decent Amazon rank because Amazon is still the best organic search engine out there. So Amazon will do some advertising for me and essentially push my book to people who might like it once they figure out where my book fits. So, yeah. Hello, Polly Cracker. All right, let's actually do this now. Cyan, magenta, and yellow. Where's my yellow? So, yeah, I was using a cold yellow when I was doing the class, but I much prefer my warm yellow. So where's my magenta? I think the thing is that the warm yellow actually does make a decent orange with the magenta. Whereas when I'm using a cold yellow and magenta, you definitely get a muted orange, but you get a better green. But I'm not usually interested in like necessarily getting a bright green, depending on the model. So I think that's why I tend to go with warm yellow. I'm more interested in getting the good orange than I am getting the good green. Most of the time I want a muted green. I don't want a bright one. If I did want a bright one, that would change which primaries I would choose, right? I would still keep cyan. Cyan is still a good middle blue. Like it just is. If you want more of a pure blue, use clear blue. I just use cyan because we always talk about, magenta, yellow, cyan. So, and although cyan has a tiny bit of white to it, it's a tiny bit of white that I would add anyway to get opacity. So I'm cool with using cyan for my blue. But yeah, all sorts of things we're talking about today. All sorts of things and stuff. Talking about the Mark Masklins class and what I learned. Talking about my book being out in hardcover. Woo, book! And yeah, hopefully we'll have a few more reviews. I once again submitted to Goodreads, by the way, that, hey, this book is my book. Can I please freaking get an author page? And Goodreads is still dragging its feet. I haven't even gotten an email from them. So I don't know if they just have 60 million people wanting author pages and they just don't get around to it or what. All right. And then I do see why artists do use black when they are using a 3-color primary system. That is one thing that I did realize. Like before we were using Rogue Shadow, right? We were using a near black, but there's a very good reason for why you would have black in there. Because otherwise, even when you're mixing these guys together and you're getting a dark, muddy color, it's not really, really dark. So you can, if you want to make sure you have a shadow, a serious shadow, you need to either use a black, pure black works, Rogue Shadow, one of the liners that is dark, like Rogue Shadow is a good one because it has higher coverage. With Cathy, maybe we'll actually use the black just to, make you all go, because I'm using black and I don't use black, but, oh, good, Dogfather. Everybody's like, chapter 3, chapter 4. And then 4 chapters from the end, when's the new one? So more and more I'm thinking that book 2 will release around September 2nd. That's kind of the date that I've got firming up in my head. Technically it's not fall, but it is kind of fall because September. So I can move up. I mean, I could totally change the text in the back of my book. I did figure out that I don't want to do a pre-order. Because for a new author, it's just actually, it isn't a good thing for a new author. It's good for established authors because it helps to push their books into the, to get early eyes on their books because they're expecting a bunch of sales. But for me, I'm a BB author. Nobody knows who I am. So yeah, better for me just not to bother with a pre-order and just to set the date it's going to be out and then promote up to that. All right, so if we're going to mix a silver, we want to mix we could just go black and white here, but that's easy. Why would we want to do that? We want to make something more interesting. So we're going to mix these 3 colors to get a gray. I'm very happy with parts of book 2, and other parts I definitely still need to grump at and make better. And then I need to throw this to my editor and have her go, but what about this? This question isn't answered, and why don't you have this character? I don't understand why this character is doing this. And then she'll give me that feedback, and I can fix things more. All right. So the way you make a gray, or a brown, but we're just focusing on gray, is you start with a color, and then you put its complement into it, right? Because if you add a complementary color to a given color, it will mute it, and eventually it will mute it all the way down into gray or brown. My cyan is like, no! I'm pokey tooling it, but it's still giving me a no. So let's just start with 2 drops of cyan. So yeah, if you want a gray or a brown, if you're mixing from scratch, first just start with a color. It doesn't matter which of these colors you start with. I start with blue for a gray because I want it colder. And then we need an orange, right? And we're going to get that orange by mixing these 2 primaries. Now, if you have any experience with mixing, you remember that you have to use a lot of yellow and just a little red, right? Because the red tends to have a really high dispersion, and that's true of magenta or regular red. And it's essentially going to overwhelm the yellow. So I'm like, all right, then I probably want 3 drops of this to 1 drop of the magenta. Let's start with that. So what's that going to do? That's going to make a green, right? But we want it to be a gray, so we add its complementary color. See, so it's all about that. And I'm just going to add 1 drop of magenta, and then we'll see how it goes. So right now we've got a 3, 2, 1. 3 yellow, 2 cyan, 1 magenta, and we're going to just mix that up and see what it is. And then we'll tune it from there using that theory of how you mute a color. So let's grab this. I'm going to grab 1 drop of water just to keep it wet. So mixing that all up, we're going to come up with something that's very blue indeed. So essentially, because the blue pigment is so powerful, it's overwhelming everything. We've got more of a teal than anything. Look at that color. Interesting, huh? I'm going to make a giant puddle of this, but that's fine because I need to still, well, actually, since it's green, let's just put some red into it and see if we can mute it out by putting red in. Still a bit too green. Needs more red. So instead of adding more yellow, I'm just going to push it until I get a gray. Then I'm going to kind of bring that gray over here, and I'm going to add some white to it to see how gray it really is. If I add white to it, it's going to show if it goes pinkish or if it goes greenish or if it goes bluish, right? That's the great thing about adding white to a color, is a darker color, is that it will show you where you are. And actually, this is a beautiful gray. Look at that. And because we used colors to mix it, it's going to have more visual interest and more life to it, as they say, than using a flat black and white gray. It's just going to have little hints of color that are going to make it a more interesting gray for the eye to look at. So I like that. That's great. Actually, I'll take even more of this dark over, and I'll add another drop of white to make my mid, and then I will carry a little bit of that over and add more white. So here's my mid-tone. I want it to be a medium dark. I like to start in a medium dark. And then we'll mix more of this over here. We'll make a triad. Yep, you add a little bit of white after you mix 3 colors together just to see if there's a bias, right? Like, I think this does have a slight teal hue to it, but it's reading as a nice gray, so I think I'm overall pretty happy with it. So we are making... Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't even realize that Bob did that, but it's totally true. You add a little white to see how your mix is going. Now that I know it's Bob Ross, I might have absorbed that when I was a child watching his show, but if so, I never realized it. It was just something that I do. So that's funny. That's cool to know, Sean. So I'm going to just add a little bit more water to these guys, and then I will start. I am going to mix there we go. So my shadow definitely reads a bit teal, but when I add the colors, it actually comes up really nice. So I'm liking this. We'll go with this. A fistic. I actually used a wet palette for half of the class with Mark over the weekend because he wanted us to start with wet palette. If I need a paint consistency that is very, very consistent, i.e. it does not change over the course of the 10 or 15 minutes or 30 minutes that I am working with it, I will always, always, always use my well. Always. So during Mark's class, when we needed, even with thick paint, so during Mark's class when we had to do that red sweater where I needed thick paint so it would actually make little bumps and simulate the knit, I mixed that in my well because I knew that if I made a big enough puddle, it would, even though it was thick, I added 1 drop of water and it still stayed plenty thick because I was using Chimera. And I was able to keep that at exactly the consistency I needed it for the 45 minutes that I was working on it. So I can use a wet palette. I see the strengths of it. It does encourage like on the fly mixing. It encourages a looser style. It makes you maybe not obsess as much and just paint if you're able to get around that part of it. Personally, for me, because I know exactly the paint consistency I want for any given technique, and I want my paint to stay there, I will always go to this because it keeps me from being frustrated. The biggest frustration I have with wet palettes is paint consistency, because every brushful is a little different. You don't need that. You just need a normal painting color theory book. Oh yeah, no, I'm not. I'm interested in writing my other books. No paint books right now. No paint books right now. Maybe if my writing business really takes off and I can afford to back off on the Patreon a little bit, then maybe. I would need to. If I was going to do a painting book, the way I would do it is I would essentially cancel my $2 tier or something, roll everybody or put the $5 tier as the $2 tier. I don't know how I'd do it. I'd probably have to cancel $2 because $2 is my least, there are the fewest people in it. And that essentially gives me an entire week that I normally work on that tier's content to work on a painting book, right? So every month I would have 1 week completely dedicated to just working on the next part of the painting book. And by the end of a year, I would probably be able then to have an entire painting book that I would be able to do, right? Consistency of flow, Aphistic. Consistency. Color's color. Like, but I mean, obviously on a wet palette, you're also not getting necessarily consistency of color, right? You can still mix up a blob, but then eventually you're going to have to remix that blob after you, like, after the water slurps out of it and you need to, like, kind of, resuscitate it. It will only go so far, right? Because usually on a wet palette, you're using smaller amounts of paint also. You're mixing. That's how I find it. I find that I use less paint in the actual each mix, right? But the most important thing isn't consistency of color. It's consistency of when I say paint consistency, I mean flow. I mean, how fluid is it? And it needs to stay at that fluidity that I need it at in order to work. Obviously, I can do like blending with wet palette. I did it on the leather and I did it on the face, actually, of that model. The blended face, that's wet palette. Like, that's why I make myself do wet palette when I go to one of these classes, if the instructor is a big wet palette user, which with Europeans, they almost always are, because it makes me do what I tell you guys all the time, where if you start out with this well palette and you get a feel for your paint consistency and what fluidity it needs to be, you will be able to eventually internalize that and then go back to the wet palette and then know when your paint consistency is right on the wet palette. It's hard on the wet palette, though, because you can't just make up a nice puddle of it. You've got to mix it brush by brush. And that is enough to, like, really frustrate some people. So that's the thing. But yeah, I always tell people, and I told this to some guys at class too. I'm like, always use both. Like, test both, learn what they can both do for you. Because with me, the well palette prevents so much frustration. I like to dial in my paint and be able to work with it. I don't like to have to remix everything. So I'm going to just start blocking in some gray on the breastplate. You can see it's very similar to the inherent bones color. It doesn't force you to work faster. In fact, it can really slow you down if you're not sure about your paint consistency, Pendrake. But what it does is make you work looser. So you can't worry so much if the color isn't a precise match. You can't worry so much if your paint is a little thinner or thicker. You have to just move with it. You have to just go. So in a way, it'll loosen you up a little bit if you're like me and you're a control freak painter. It can help you to loosen up if you are seeking to do that. But at this point in my life, with my hobby, I know that I like to be able to control my paint consistency, because if I can control my paint consistency, that's one less thing I have to worry about. I can just paint then. I know that my paint is going to be at the right fluidity level to execute on the technique that I want to execute it on, instead of me freaking out about it and worrying about it. So a lot of people say that the wet palette gives you a more artsy, more artistic result, because you will probably see brush strokes, because you will see shifts in color that just happen because the painters had to remix their paint. It will essentially emulate what, a canvas painter is normally dealing with, right? Ooh, this plate on the back is pretty cool. I can't wait to paint that in NMM. So more painterly, quote unquote, style, as one artist put it. Whereas, with me, I like technical, I like more precision. I like fewer brush strokes. I like to control everything. I like subtlety, but I like to choose my path. I don't like to be dictated to by the whims of the palette. So that's why I don't enjoy the wet palette. I can use it, I can get good results with it, if I must, but I do not enjoy it. And that's simple. And when it comes down to it, it's my hobby. I want to enjoy it. I'm going to use my well. I'll tell you what I told them at the class sophistic when they saw me using this, and they're like, "Doesn't your paint dry out?" No, I mixed these 5 minutes ago. These are going to stay this consistency for a good half hour, so that I don't have to worry about them drying out. If your paint is drying out in your well palette, either your wells are too big or you're not using enough paint. And the key here is that if you're using thicker paint, use the wet palette. If you are willing to thin your paint at all, use the well. Because this is probably about a 4-to-1 as far as my paint consistency. So I am adding water, but I'm not adding very much. It's 4 drops of paint to 1 drop of water, roughly. Some of these may even be 5-to-1. So, but just that little bit of water and the fact that I'm making this big paint puddle means that the surface area is reduced and the paint doesn't have as much area to evaporate from, right? It's got a nice deep puddle of fluid underneath it, which is about that deep. And that's a lot of fluid. So it's essentially going to keep this paint wet. All the people I know of who have problems with the well palette are not using enough paint and water. And, right. And it depends on how much later. Because if you want this to stay good for 3 days, it's not gonna. But if you want it to stay good till tomorrow, you just put a drop of water in each of the wells around it. You put saran wrap or cling wrap over the top, and it's just fine to work on the next day. I have kept one of these alive for a full week of painting as I essentially moved through colors. Like I would start out and keep this set alive for 3 days, and then I would switch to a different portion of the mini and do a new set of colors. No, see, I love that because the thing about that in RS is it does, right? The wet palette has become the standard, right? Whereas I'm like, I'm one of the last holdouts so these days of the well palette, the dry palette. So, do we just have a hiccup? Because it just welcomed me to the chat room again. I don't know, Cornico, because, I've used a wet palette and a well palette in Santa Fe when it was warm and dry. High desert. You're fine? Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So when I'm painting, I'm typically just using a block of 6 or a block of 8 or whatever. So wherever my paint goes, I'm putting a drop of water or a brush full in all the wells around. And that's just going to create more humidity underneath the cling wrap, right? So that's what I'm looking to do. And if these have thickened up at all, I will drop a single drop of water in each. Then I will put my cling wrap on and I won't come back to it for a full day. And the next evening when I sit down to paint, it's going to be fine. Okay, that's unnerving, Nara. Nobody uses the plastic plate anymore. So yeah, and to be honest, I don't find that I can keep paint good on a wet palette. Like, even when my palette was getting really dry at the class, when I came back the next day, it was still wet enough to have totally flooded and ruined all my paints. And it was a pretty dry palette at that point. Like, during the course of the day, as the edges of my paper actually started to dry up, then the paint wouldn't change consistency. But, like, if it's anything other than that, I feel like I can't, it's like, it doesn't work for me. It doesn't at all. And I was using thicker paint. I was using Chimera colors this weekend. Except for my beloved Pure White, which was still MSP. So I feel like sometimes I honestly have to change my freaking wet palette paper every time I paint anyway. So why not use the well palette at that point? Yeah, that's what I always say, right? In RI, I'm like, try both. Figure out what both are good at, because they're good for different things. And, it's going to vary, too, with the paint that you use. Like, which brand are you using? And how much paint do you use? Although I do find that I have to use just as much paint on the wet palette as I do on the well in order to keep it from wicking too much fluid up into it. I'm going to just quickly do a gray over. I like the gray now, so I'm going to do a gray over everything. Then we're probably going to line because she's got a lot of different plates here. And I feel like I need to line them to kind of make them stand out. And I need to figure out if I'm going to do some trim in gold or something. Which I probably will do. But I'm going to gray first. Yeah, and that makes sense. Volnavia, Morbius. Volnavia. It makes sense because as I come from traditional art world as well. And gouache is... when a traditional painter starts miniature painting, they almost always say something like, this is just like gouache. Like, gouache is the closest traditional medium to the paint that we use for miniatures. So I always found that interesting. So what you say there, it resonates here. Yeah, oh yeah, this is NMM, Sean. If I was going metallics, I would start with a darker gray. But, another thing that I would say is it's got to be NMM. Like, with all of these little tiny details and plates, you could do this with metal, but it wouldn't look nearly as good, in my opinion. I think you have a lot more leeway to make it look awesome. I'm just going to do everything, and then we'll figure out if the boot is probably showing through back there, But that's one of my calls that I personally make with NMM versus metallics is there a lot of intricate detail on the metal? Because if there is, it will almost always look better, in my opinion, in NMM. Because NMM lets you control the highlights and bring out the details much easier. You can do it with metallics, but it's not nearly as simple. And even then, you'll always have, the environment will always be working against you. But yeah, I mean, it's like Inara says, and like I always say, is use both palettes. I feel I push the well palette so much because I know that the vast majority of the voices out there in miniature painting nowadays are pushing for the wet. And so I feel like I need to talk about the well because everybody else is talking about the wet. And some people are going to find that the well palette is much, much better for them than the wet palette. There are other people like me. And so I need to keep talking about it. But there is always the chance that, because David is like that, David uses a wet palette exclusively. He would find it very hard to get used to my well palette. Like, he's got his stuff dialed in, but he's been painting for years, and at a high level for many years now. He's got it all internalized. He knows how to use his wet palette, and he knows how to get the results he wants. When you're starting, it pays to try both to figure out where your sweet spot is to start out. And that doesn't mean that just because when you try both and you settle on one, it doesn't mean you never go back to the other one. Like me, you should probably make yourself go back every once in a while just to keep your hand in, because as you paint more, your style can morph. And what can happen then is that the palette that was best for you when you started may no longer be the best palette for you. Maybe you discover a new love of the wet palette or the well palette as you get, more experienced with miniatures. So you should always try them when you start out, but then you should also make yourself retry them. Like, every time I do a class, I make myself retry the wet palette for the first day at least. And only paint with it. And in that way, I can appreciate it for what it does well. Yeah, exactly. So just like I said, Crows, just there, is as you develop as a painter, as you use the other palette, maybe you'll come to a new appreciation of it and you'll end up switching over to it. And that's totally cool. There is no one right way. Ever. Never let if some instructor tells you there's only one way to do things, question that instructor. Keep that little question mark in your head while you're listening to them. Because there really isn't. There isn't even a best way. There's only a best way for you. Yeah, and it tends to go like that, crows. Pay attention to your water level. That could be the problem. If you find that you have really variable experiences with the wet palette, watch your water level. The water level in the wet palette directly impacts how the paint works. Oh, okay. What was it, Aphistic? Can somebody hold on? What is it? What is it? What is it? Let me find it. Back of the model. Oh yeah, the pooling paint. It's not the case because I'm already thinning my paint. So you can see that I can still see all the details. Even the little rivets are still standing out. When you thin your paint like this, it's not generally going to obscure detail unless you put many layers on a Aphistic. It's when your paint is full strength and you're using a thicker paint to begin with that you really run that risk. But if you have like this, like I said, this is 4:1, plus it's Master Series, and Master Series is itself a more fluid, thinner paint. I don't worry about it. The Master Series primer can definitely glob up details, so you need to watch that. But in general, MSP is thin enough that unless I put on many layers, it will not begin to lose detail. Yep. Yeah, because GW's base paint is very thick. What I'll tell you, Aphistic, what I always did back when I was working at the GW store, I would doctor the GW paint bottles. I would take my mixture of water and flow improver, and I would add like 20 or 40 drops into the bottle, just enough to actually thin the paint just a little bit. And what it did was it kept the paint from drying too fast in the bottle, and it also made it more of a fluid consistency, but still decent coverage, so I could use it better. And then I would add a tiny bit of drying retarder to it as well so that it wouldn't dry out. And when I left my job at GW store, when I ran into one of the employees later, he complained to me that the paint sucked again because I wasn't there to doctor it. Yes, exactly. So, and that informed my my Reaper Master Series creation, because then I was like, why don't we just add Flow Improver right out the gate? Because I used to. So we tested it to make sure that it wouldn't impact the paint over time. And then when it didn't, we were like, all right, let's rock this. But yeah, I mean, this is just such a thin coat. You're not gonna glob up detail. That's why I didn't deal with it. It wasn't that I didn't see it. I saw it. I was like, it's not gonna matter. And they did, some people, when I was at Games Workshop, Volnavia, and I was working out when the headquarters was in Glen Burnie, Maryland. I was actually out there hanging out with those guys and working with them. And one of them told me that, when the GW was first talking about their bottles and their paint lines, that they intended that they essentially went, if we make a bottle that doesn't have the longevity, that has more airflow, the paint will dry out and people will have to buy more often. I don't know if that's true, because it's always urban legends when it comes to Games Workshop. But this guy had been around a while, so maybe. I don't know how you'd control that, Pendrake. I mean, you'd have to have something that would consistently... The problem is you'd have to have a humidity sensor or something, or like a water level sensor, and then it would have to be automated where it would sense when the water level got below a certain point, or the humidity level, and it would then feed water into the wet palette to keep it at that level. But that would probably be a more expensive wet palette than anybody wanted to buy, except for a few people. No, going to bed at like 8:30 Central, not a good idea, Valendar. Planned obsolescence, yeah. So, yeah, it'd be $200. Somebody would buy it. Yep, exactly. They could have gone to droppers, but they didn't. But that's part of their philosophy too. They're not going to want to go to droppers because they choose the paint out of the paint bottle thing. Like they want it to be that way, I think. Oh well. It is what it is. GW is still less evil than it used to be. But it's still evil. The evil empires. In my opinion, when a company goes public, you can't trust them anymore. Ed, I'm afraid that's Ed. That's Ed speaking through me. Like, Ed never wanted Reaper to become a publicly traded company because he wanted to be able to call the shots with Reaper based on what was good for Reaper and its customers, not based on what shareholders wanted. Because shareholders, all they care about is the money. So they are going to make a worse customer experience almost always, because as long as they can do it and still get sales and it will bring in more money, they will do it. And that's what Ed taught me. Yeah, that's smart, Volnavia. Because if they can still make money, why would they care about customer experience? Oh, I missed this hip. Oh no, I missed a hip. Hip, hip, hooray. And this thigh. But yeah, that's so smart. I always put my GW paints, I would thin them a bit, and then I would put them into dropper bottles. And then I just use them that way. Because every once in a while, GW had a color I really liked. So I would doctor it and use it. Yeah, it is. It is hard to see. Yep. But yeah, all these little details. So many little details on this model. So now we need to figure out, and I'm going to hold off on the shield for now. Well, yeah, because chances are the shield, I'll do the gray. I'll do a gray surround on it. So the outer edge, I'll go with the silver. The sun is going to be gold for sure. And probably the rivets here on the shield are going to be gold. And probably the background is actually going to be blue. But we'll see. But I'll make the outside armor. Ed was always pretty proud of our customer service experience. Like the fact that we were known for having good customer service. I mean, Ed was definitely not evil. Alrighty, so we've got pretty good coverage across the board on all these things, and it's time to get our lining out and start lining and start thinking about where our gold is going to go. But just the lining alone is going to make this model, like, make all the details start to pop out. Yep. That's because it's Cathy in her plot armor. Cathy is a modern individual, but in archaic armor. But yeah. Although technically didn't spectacles exist? I don't know if they existed long enough ago to have somebody who wore... They probably wouldn't wear their glasses into combat anyway, even if they did have spectacles. I don't know. The history of eyeglasses. I don't immediately remember when spectacles became common use. 1500s. I knew Pendragon could be there for me. Well, the thing about it, Richard, is, and I pointed this out to the dudes too, it's like, I tend to use like just as much paint on the wet palette, and I tend to waste a bunch of it because, like I said, over time or overnight, the water will flood into the paint and it'll totally wreck it. So I'm like, then I have to toss it out anyway. So I don't find that I actually like waste paint. Because I always have a nice big blob of whatever colors I'm using on my wet palette because I like to be able to mix new highlights and stuff. So that's right. Ben Franklin had bifocals, which means that regular glasses were earlier than that, but that was 1700s. So probably 1500s or late 14. You're right. But yeah, so I think that people over exaggerate or have an overblown idea of paint wastage, either way. And I think that you're gonna waste paint no matter what, and that you can just remember there's an awful lot of paint in those bottles. All right, so if we're gonna make a liner, I need to use black at this point, because I said that I was only going to use these three primaries plus white plus black. But I'm going to mix colors into the black because I don't want a flat black liner. That can look very cartoony, and I don't want this model to be cartoony. Now, I do know that black is very powerful, though, so I'm only going to use 2 drops in my palette. Common in the upper class by 1450s. Okay. So yeah, so that was definitely armor time. So you could have run into this historically. Well, of course, it probably would have been parade armor, right? Because you wouldn't wear your glasses into combat. Maybe you wouldn't even be in. Well, you probably. I can imagine a noble like putting on the family armor and like wearing their glasses when it was just a parade and not actual combat. So this is not as unfeasible. The magenta hair is probably far more unfeasible than anything else. But yes, this is, if you didn't know Ediphistic, this is actually a tribute miniature based on a living person on the modern day. And this is a miniature to help fund her healthcare right now during their difficult times that they're going through. There we go, Valandar, we got it. Yeah, so there we go. The magenta hair is actually the thing on this model that's the most. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some of these in to my black. And what that's going to give me is it's going to give me a brown. So I'm going to put in a couple drops of magenta, which will take it to a very, very dark magenta. And then I'm going to put in some drops of yellow. And the key here is to keep it from going... the magenta is going to turn it purple with the black. So then what do we do to neutral it out? We add its complement, which is this yellow. And we want to actually add a little extra complement, or because we want it to go brown instead of gray. So if you want it to go brown instead of gray, you have to push it more toward yellow. But because there's black here, and black plus yellow equals green, we might have to add more red to really get the effect we want. But I do want it to stay very dark, so I'm going 2 drops of magenta, 3 drops of yellow. Probably going to need more yellow, but I'm just going to see what I get, and we're going to tune from there. So essentially, when you do this, don't overthink it. Just make your best guess and run with it. Oh, it was Henry VIII. Okay. So it went green, which is kind of what I expected. You can kind of see that it's a dark, mucky olive drab. See that greenish tone there? It's kind of like, it'd be a good grime, vehicle grime or engine grime kind of color. So if it's green, in order to drag it back to neutral, we have to add its complementary color, which is red. And in this case, our red is magenta. So I'm going to just do a drop. Mix it in. To combat that, that greenish tone. Need a little bit more. And essentially, I'm just going to slowly tune it until I get what I want, which is a nice dark tone. And if I want it to go a little bit colder, I can add a little tiny bit of blue. But if it's already slightly greenish, adding the blue is just going to double down on that. So you always got to assess it afterwards. But I want a little colder. A little colder. That's decent. You're never going to get a beautiful, clear, rich brown out of this. You're always going to get mud. But mud is okay to line with. I just want it not to be black. And the one thing that the black in this mix does is it gives it higher coverage, even as I thin it. So I'm going to add one more drop of water just to thin it so that I can line with it better. Mix that up. Oh, Quindy, I have an appointment that I need to do next week, Tuesday, I think. So we're going to cancel stream next week, Tuesday. Wanted to remember to bring that. I'm pretty sure it's the 25th, I think. And that's I think, Tuesday. Yeah. So it should be next week, Tuesday, that we will not have an and stream because I have an appointment to get to. Yep. I'll double check that and message you. I'll put that on my to-dos, Quindy, just to make sure we got the right date. Message, Quindy, date confirmation. There we go. Now you're on my to-dos. What I would do without my to-dos. Yes, Wappel, yes. So let's see if this will work. I could also have gone with a dark blue and done a blue liner, and if I don't like this particular brown on this, then I may do that. Could also have gone with a dark magenta. Just going to block in a shadow underneath this, just to see if the dark versus light ratio is good. I need to see if it's dark enough to bring out the details. So all these little plates, I will tend to line around. And I could wait. But if I start to do NMM and blending and stuff on these plates, you know, I'm going to be risking, if I get a result I like, I'm risking, you know, the liner or making a mistake with the liner and wiping out some of my work. So in this case, not always, but in this case, I think I prefer to line at the beginning. And then if I have to reline, I can reline. But here I can mess up and be a little imprecise and easily touch it up. This is a really high precision miniature. Like everything is really precise on it. If I needed this to go a little darker, I also could add more black. Still got a little muddy down here, but I can still touch it up. But yeah, given how much of a pain it is to line all these little plates, it makes a lot more sense to do it when you have the freedom to touch it up. And to not worry about the fact that you're making mistakes. And the other thing we can do is as we come in to highlight this, we can also like tighten up our details. So we don't have to fix everything if we're a little bit mucky. We know we're going to be painting over this metal. And as we bring in highlights and shadows for that, we'll have the opportunity to clean up some things. And what I will probably try to do, hi Roger, is I'll just black in the lion. Make sure to get around the outside of the outline, but also fill it in. because I know that's going to be gold. And then I'll go over the top, just the top surface. And that's why it's so important to line around the outside of each of these little bits. So you want the side of the lion to be blocked in. Because the top, I'll go over it with white. And then I'll be doing my gold over that. So if we don't take the opportunity to just go around it in dark color in advance, it'll be very hard to line around it without, further having to do touch-ups. But if we do it in advance, then we just have to paint the top with white and we'll have a nice outlined lion. Huge! Huge, the old one. Oh my god, lining is huge. I wish I could have showed you my class model before I lined it. Like, that was another thing that Mark was, like, all about. Because for his style, the hard lining actually helps it pop out. So, like, this area looked really just kind of mucky and all ran together before I put in lining. So even on a big model like this, if you just imagine no dark lines right here, it would all run together. And after I lined it, everything looked so much sharper. It's the same thing with the line, the hard dark line down the center, down this area. There is actually lining here. Yeah, exactly. So I think it has a huge difference in the final outcome of the model, especially at 28, but it even had a huge difference on this model. Because when you add that lining, you add definition, and then your natural techniques, your textures, then look more real because they have the comparison between that sharp line and those textures. It pops, right? So on these models, old one, it's ridiculously huge. The only difference is if you are working on a model that has a lot of black on it, old one, then probably, her foot came off. I'll have to re-glue her. But like without lining, there's like little dark lines all around each of these little tiny panels. And without that lining, it would all run together. You wouldn't see the fine details nearly as much. So, like on the back here, there's no lining around those little symbols. And so they just kind of blend in a little bit. They aren't as sharp, right? They aren't as crisp. They're depending on the difference between the dark blue and the gold, but that means they're not as crisp. Unlike the front where I lined around all of the gold edging and everything, every little detail comes out. The only way you can get away with outlining is if you alternate your light and dark like a pro. Like if you are... This model does not need as much lining. She's done with near black and very pale contrast. So the fact that I'm alternating like the gold with the red black, with the silver, with the red black, and the skin with the red black, that means that there's very little lining that is actually used on this model because you're going from really light to really dark in general, except around the face, where I had to make the hair lined between the face and the hair. I had to put a line there or you wouldn't be able to see the features. So if you're doing something with really pale skin and dark clothing and then a bunch of silver and gold to kind of separate out the clothing, you might be able to get away with outlining. But if you have anything else, especially on a 28 where you need those details to really come out, I feel like you're really missing an opportunity if you don't line. Now, at your peril, you also could just use washes. Because a dark wash is going to give you natural lining, right? And then you just don't paint over it. You leave it in the cracks. But I don't like washes because they make more work for me. So like if I put a dark wash over all of Cathy's armor right now, I would have to go and paint all of it over and try not to occlude all the lines, which would cost me a lot of time. So instead, because I've learned to line, and doing lining also has a fringe benefit. It develops your brush control. Lining more than any other single technique will give you the brush control to paint things like tiny buckles, rivets, and eyeballs. Super, yeah, give it a try, Fistic. Yeah, what Kodak just said. Because you're practicing it. Like, to do lining, you are of necessity working on your fine motor. Because the lines are precise. And that's what lets you do this stuff. Usually when I have a beginning painter, like at Paint Club, when I used to teach Paint Club at Reaper, when I had a beginning painter and they were pretty much just putting down their mid-tone and doing a shadow and maybe dry brushing or whatever, I told them line it. And if they did it, the miniature instantly looked 2 levels better than it was. Oh, everybody. Yes. Yeah, that for sure, Agent Marvel. Lining can also help you figure out what's what. So, although it is no technique is an end-all be-all technique like you must do it, but I highly recommend at least trying it and seeing what it does for your painting. And like I said, it's a win-win because it's going to make you a better painter just because of the brush control thing. Because you need brush control to do so much of the fine detail on this stuff. If you're working on bigger figures, caveat here, if you're working on like historical figures, then your lining may not be lining. You may actually just use some dark shading to make things stand out. So you can choose to do that instead, where instead of lining, you just choose a very dark shadow and you'd use that to define everything. So you can do that. That's okay, Sakurai. Everybody takes time to figure out what to tell people. Yeah, see, Richard, for washes, for me, I used to use them heavily when I was like making my transition from intermediate to advanced painter. I would say I relied a lot on washes, but then I actually like kind of timed myself and realized how much time I was like wasting correcting after the wash. Because the wash would wipe out my midtone and drop everything down a level, and then I had to go back over it. And if I learned lining, sure, it would take me longer to line than it would to apply the wash, but it was still actually faster than going back and correcting all of my midtone without painting over those wash lines to preserve them. So again, how you paint is how you paint. If it works for you, paint. Then it works for you. Keep going. But that was my personal experience with washes. That's what made me go away from them. That, and I hated the dirty look. And in the USA these days, I ran into more than one person over the years in this stream who essentially had been told that they must do washes. Like washes, you learn to base coat, you learn to wash, and you learn to highlight. And minds were blown when I said, no, you don't need to wash. You don't need to learn to wash. You could put off learning to wash until much later in your painting development and not lose anything. You would essentially go to shading and lining instead. Purposeful shading and lining, intentional shading and lining, where you aren't just putting the color over everything. Yeah, this is a long lining job too. Think about how, man, you would think that a wash would make this easier. You would. But then when you had to come back and try to like highlight these super fine things, maybe not. Some of these details are ridiculous small too. Like these little bands around her wrist. Yep, I use the same brush for pretty much a whole miniature Ephistic, unless I'm doing a big glaze or if I do a wash over a section. Because those paints are very watery, I'll use a different brush because I don't want to compromise this one. But the brushes that I use, and this is very indicative of the shape and type that I use, you know, I only am dipping it this far into the paint. It's got a great tip. There's no reason I can't use it for base coating and highlighting and lining and all the same. If you really worry about your brush wear and tear, you could just go to Taklons for your base coat and use your good brushes just for everything else, and that's fair too. Right, exactly, Agent Marvel, but you don't have to wash. Yeah. See, Valandar, that's weird to me because washes actually look so much better when you don't start dark. Although I can see why, because then your wash, you're no matter what, you're working up from the dark, right? So then the wash doesn't waste your time, so that makes sense. And again, if it works for you, it works for you. And that's it. Don't let anybody tell you that you're wrong. Do be open to trying new things. I found that starting dark and working light in general let me in for more work. But some people do it very quickly. Like Sergio starts dark and works light on everything. And, you know, he's a very fast painter when it comes down to it. Oh, we're past 11. Yep, and that's the way it's taught here. Yep, yeah, you come to depend on them, Richard, and you don't learn to see shadows and paint them in yourself, necessarily. But, I mean, if you're happy there, you're happy there. That's the way it is. Like, not everybody wants to get to high level. Not everybody wants to learn to do a particular technique. Not everybody needs to. Will it give you a different effect if you learn? Yeah, probably. Do you care about that? That's up to you. I mean, it's your hobby. Do what you want. It's kind of like, I always talk about how I started knitting last year, and it's good because it reminds me of what it's like to be a beginner in a craft or an art. And the biggest thing that exemplifies this attitude in my knitting is, you know, some people will say, why are you still doing just those beginning stitches? And it's like, well, I don't really care enough or have the oomph to try anything more difficult right now, so I'm just enjoying doing these 2 stitches, you know? Yes, cable needles can do some cool stuff. Do I have the oomph to even like figure out how to do that right now? No, I don't. I'm happy in my hole. And so, yeah, more power to you. Like, Richard, it's just like you do what you want. It's your hobby. If you want to learn to try to do things differently, you know that you have us here on the stream to show you how to do it. Yeah, exactly. Baba. Although not for David. Some people do get that free card. Like my guy can just look at, like, light is a natural for him. He's a weird mutant. Like, I'm sure he wasn't always like that, but it's just like some things, there will be a time in your painting career when somebody shows you a technique and it just clicks for you. And that's how it was with David and light. So sometimes, you know, something will click in your head and you'll just be like, oh yeah, this, and you'll end up picking up a new thing. All right. Some of this is just so shallow. Some of this detail is just so shallow. There's a plate that comes in here. And there's a belt that comes in here. And I am dotting all the little rivets because then it's easy to highlight them. Quindy. Yes, so there we go. Yep, and sometimes that's your free card, and then you're like, that helps you, right? Then they give you a tool that feels intuitive to you. That's nice. And all these little plates. But see how everything's starting to be, that lining makes all of the details start to come out. Yeah, I'm about to learn a new cast on technique for my new shawl. My cowl is almost halfway done now, and I think it's the later part of it's going to go really fast. Because I have gotten used to the pattern now, and I just need time to sit down and do it. So I'll be happy to finish my second knitting project once I have the cowl done. And I did a seed stitch on this one, a double seed stitch with 2 and 2. And you know, you learn something like every time you try a technique in any medium, any artistic medium, even if you end up like not having an ideal result, you learn something from it. So for me, I did a seed stitch on this cowl, but it ended up not showing up in the pattern very much because one, the yarn was variegated, but more importantly, the yarn was slightly fuzzy. And so the fuzziness means that the pattern didn't show up as crisply. So I learned something. So even though I didn't get a crisp pattern like my mom's baby blanket that I was trying to copy, I learned from that if I do want to do pattern stuff, I need to choose a yarn that's not as fluffy. So it's you still learn it, and it's a really soft cowl, so I don't really mind if I can't see the seed stitch really good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Direct with the dry brush highlight. Yeah, Rhonda's got a great aptitude for breaking stuff down. I love how she breaks down art principles in technique. And we've got a little bit of another plate up here. This is just such intricate armor. Like there is no way I would have done this sucker in metallics. I don't think I could have done it justice in metallics. It would be much easier in metallics, but so painting in shadow, I'm just going to paint this whole, I'm not going to line here, I'm just going to paint a deep dark shadow here on the back of the loincloth up against the thigh because no light's going to get in here. So we're just going to put our dark shadow all over in there. I can always come back and blend in that area and pick up a little bit of color toward the bottom of the loincloth, no problem. But I gotta remind myself that this is all in deep shadow and you're not going to see much. Good deal, Richard. You're almost done. Somebody else was asking when the next book was going to come out, so probably September 2nd. I'm halfway through editing it right now. Halfway through editing book 2. Halfway through editing book 2 and started the planning for book 3. Trying to figure out my process of writing a book. Just like you figure out your process of painting a mini when you're new to it. Alrighty, so we're really getting that lining in now, and we can look really close to see how that separates out and makes all those plates visible. And I've got about time check, so. Yeah. The book pile. We all have book piles. I appreciate it, though. If you have the time to leave a review, even if it's just giving me some stars, that would be great. If you don't, I understand. Just got to get those 10 reviews. That's my goal. We're getting closer. It just takes a while when you're a noob. You're a noob with one book. Nobody knows who you are. Then you're a noob with 2 books, and then you're a noob with 3 books, and then by the 4th book, people are starting to notice you. That's pretty much how I'm going. I actually was reading, because I'm restarting the Tony Hillerman Navajo mystery series. It's really interesting because I went and kind of read through his history a bit. And his wife actually has continued writing the series, which is kind of cool. I hadn't realized that. But now I'm going to be much more interested to watch how the style changed from between the book where she took over, right? But he didn't actually have a breakout book where people really started to notice him until his 7th book. Was one of the things I read yesterday. Like, the series was okay, and it had a small audience, but then when he got Chi and Lee Porn together, working together, that was his breakout novel. So sometimes it takes a while before people notice what you're doing. Oh, yeah. Sure, that sounds great, Quindy, because they can find... I've got the Barnes & Noble and Amazon links and stuff on there, and etc. That would be lovely. Thank you. Yeah, the author site's great, because I'm going to probably be like doing a little bit of an updates blog and stuff on there eventually, once I have the... That's better done in the beginning of the month. Once I have some breathing room. Once I'm not directly trying to finish like book 2, like get it to a point where I can toss it to my editor. Then I'll have a moment of breathing room where I can take a week and get a new section in my author site where I can put updates and news and stuff. And of course I have my newsletter, which is also gonna be there as well. I was just thinking it would be cool to have a part of my website where I can put up sample chapters of the next book. Things like that. It's harder to do that on... I could do it in the newsletter if I did a file. So maybe I would do it for the newsletter first and then eventually put like the first 2 or 3 chapters up of the new book on my website. That's something that I can do because I'm just me and not traditionally published. There we go. So we'll just darken in the back of the shield. Again, shadow. Ah, thanks, Valandar, for that tip. Yeah, the author website really is the hub that all the author news and author stuff should come from. So, and the newsletter gives you advanced heads up on stuff. So, like, my newsletter peeps are going to be able to see new covers before anybody else of future books. They're going to get more updates about how the book is coming. They may get sample chapters before anybody else does, or they may be the only people to get sample chapters. Also, my newsletter is going to, my author newsletter, when I pull people from, when I'm looking for people to advance read a book, to get essentially a free advance copy in exchange for an honest review, I'll pull from my newsletter. So if anybody is going to be interested at some point in doing that, in getting an advanced copy, being part of my ARC team, as they call it, Advanced Reader Copy. What that does is essentially doing an ARC team lets you get reviews up on the book right at release. And Amazon is okay with that as long as you put certain text in your review. So, also anybody who's interested in being a beta reader can also toss me a note. I'll reach out essentially to the newsletter crew for that as well. Pretty much if you're on my newsletter, I assume that you are really interested in my stuff or in my welfare or in my future, professional writer goodness. And you may be the kind of person who would want to help me out that way. Yay, there it is. Thanks. Woo! Woo! It's official. How many hardcovers do you guys think I should bring to ReaperCon? Like, I was thinking just like 6. Because hardcovers are expensive. They're like almost double the cost of the trade paper. And I'll probably actually discount. Like, it probably will be twice the cost of the trade paper. I'm not sure how many people actually. 6,000. I can't carry that many in my car and still fit a Kiki. She would eat them all. Maybe 12 is the answer. I won't have very many. But I do want to bring some to ReaperCon, so. Yeah, no, that's cool, Quindy. Yeah, with proofreading, I'm very much looking for people who have an eye for that, who have essentially when I put it out, when I put the book out, there was one person who got back to me right away with like had found errors, and so that person is definitely a person who is going to get to look at all the rest of my stuff. But yeah, I'll figure out how I'm going to do that, how I'm going to put together an advanced reader team and stuff like that when we get closer to West of the Moon. Because then I can, if the book is done early, like I intend and foresee it, I should have time to get some people advanced copies. But yeah, if you feel you've got a good eye for that kind of thing, for catching errors or for giving feedback, then definitely contact me. All right, I think I'm going to pop that in and just end there. There's just so much. There's just so much lining to do here. But it does help me, as I do lining, as I do this kind of thing, where it's really methodical and you kind of get in the zone and you just go. I'm also thinking about stuff like, how am I going to paint this? Where's my highlight coming from? What color is this? Is this leather? Is this metal? That kind of thing. So it's the people who, if you really like my genre, if you're into young adult fantasy, like, because right away, the first thing you need is your target audience, right? So if you really like young adult fantasy, if you read my first book and you really, really liked it, and you want to help me out, like, yeah. I mean, it's, I think I've got my author email. I think it's Ann at aebeckerwrites.com. my author email is on my website. So toss me a note if you care, and we will start putting together a list. That would be the first. Yeah, I know, right? Where's your sweater? I could actually paint a sweater, but not at this scale, at that scale. Like if I was going to try to do what Mark did on a model this small, I think I'd just have to do individual little dots. Like I wouldn't be able to do the V. I'd just have to suggest it with the dots. You can read it for free if you're a Kindle Unlimited person, Aphistic. You don't even have to spend any money, other than the money you're already spending if you're in Kindle Unlimited. But yeah. Yeah, you should be able, actually, you should be able to get it from Amazon.uk, Richard. It should be there. Hold on, let's look. Let's go and look. Amazon.uk. Oh, I thought it, .co.uk. Sorry. There we go. Yeah, sure. So I've never gone here, actually. I've never gone to Amazon's UK site. There I am. Hardcover is not available on UK yet. It should be. So yeah, you can get it on Amazon UK. Amazon.co.uk, sorry. So that should just be shipping within, right? Because it should be available at almost... I set pricing for every country that Amazon had a subsidiary in. So yeah. Alrighty. I need to get out and getting the puppy to a walk, because we have to do our car smog inspection today right after. So I need to move. Yes. Have a great afternoon, Turgeon. Thanks for telling me about the hardcover. I was going to check, but it's cool that you let me know right away. But yeah, hardcover is not available in UK yet, so hopefully it will be. Ingram's should distribute it. But I don't know. Maybe not to Amazon, though. I'll have to see. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We actually did get a fair amount of distance on Cathy. She is starting to have her armor develop. This is going to look fantastic. I already love it. And tomorrow is Sophie Day. Sophie Day. I think I said I was going to do leather. I want to get the leather done, and then the only things left will be the chainmail, the coif around her neck, and some other stuff, the gold. But I want to get the leather. So yeah. So we'll work on her tomorrow. At some point, I need to attach the wings. I'm getting that point. I probably need to do the gold, the brass fixtures on the sword, before I can attach the wings. But we're getting there. We're getting there, folks. We're getting there. Thanks so much. And yeah, I hope to see you all tomorrow. Have a lovely day. Thanks, Quindy, for riding herd as usual.